Are you ready? And while we wait, Pak Daud, research interest is around Austronesian studies, cultural resources management, museology, prehistoric archaeology, theory and methods in archaeology. And today we have the honor to listen to his presentation about Paradise Betrayed, Island World of Austronesians, Commodity and Globalization. So Pak Daud, silakan. 25 minutes is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank to the committee of this international conference for inviting me to present my paper here and to share ideas and also get some input from you all. Yeah. So, yeah, my paper is about entitled Paradise Betrayed, Island World of Austronesian, Commodity and Globalization. The island world has fascinated humans since the beginning of history. Around 1.5 million years ago, the first human, Homo erectus, and later Homo florensis, ventured into the island world of Southeast Asia and explored as far as Flores Island in the eastern part of Indonesia. They managed to adapt and thrive in the island environment. And for the first time in the history, humans were capable of crossing a narrow strait which separated the chain of islands in southern Indonesian archipelago. Since then, waves of modern human, Homo sapiens, have continued to explore and make a living from the richness and uniqueness of the island world. Yeah. There are a variety of human feelings and perception about island life that are sometimes paradoxical. There are those who consider it is exotic, romantic, interesting to visit and research, very affectionate, peaceful, and feeling at home. Others find it very scary, want to stay away from it, and hate it, boring, feel isolated, and imprisoned. However, most would agree that each island creates a unique atmosphere and is very rich in biodiversity, flora and fauna, as well as natural phenomena. Islands are a refuge for the chaos of the world. It is a place to heal and transform. Hence, it is a paradise. It is not just humans who are intrigued by life of island. Animals are the same. Island, especially the remote ones, offer an easier life for animals. It is where nature nurture and preserve a rare animal species. Islands seem to be a living laboratory for fauna and flora as well. It is a place where we can still encounter endemic flora and fauna that are unique or already extinct in other places. Island world has become a showcase for evolution. That's the reason why Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace conceived the theory of evolution during their research on the island of Galapagos and Malay archipelago, respectively. The uniqueness and the natural diversity of islands world has become a commodity for human in the form of goods, knowledge, experience, as well as imagination. Unique items such as flora, fauna, stone, mineral, etc. found on the island are exotic goods and valuable, precious commodity that have been exchanged for tens of thousands of years ago. As you see from the, it's not too clear in this map over there. Actually, they describe some of the exchange system between islands in Southeast Asia. Yeah, but because yeah, it is not island. Okay, island as a living laboratory have facilitated researchers research with extraordinary and highly distinctive results, not only in natural sciences like evolution, but also socio-cultural sciences. Like I showed it here. There are some anthropological works over in Pacific, for example, yeah, and also there are some theory for like a function theory, functionalism, yeah, structuralism is also found in this study of island. Yeah. The impressive experience of visiting the island world has also fostered busy tourism activities up to now. Yeah. Fantasies about life in the island world have resulted in many works of literature and art, including Plato's Atlantic. Yeah, the title is Timaeus and Critias. Yeah, Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, and there are many artistic work and literature was based on the island life. It was these commodities offered by the island environment that some 4,000 years ago facilitated the Austronesian speaking people of Southeast Asia island to trigger a global process in the southern hemisphere, from the east coast of Africa to eastern corner of the Pacific. Austronesian speaking people originated from Taiwan and migrated to Southeast Asia island approximately 5,000 years ago. With their skill in navigating the sea, they migrate rapidly from island to island to the south, north, and west. They migrated by leapfrogging mechanism to reach strategic island over long distance. However, they still maintain the relation with their homeland. When they had managed to colonize the strategic island, they inhabited the smaller island around them. Such migration mechanism has triggered a kind of globalization, with Austronesian culture had become the dominant culture adopted by communities in Indo-Pacific world, from Madagascar to Easter Island and from Taiwan to New Zealand. This is very vast, almost half of the globe. The globalization process had facilitated long-distance exchange of exotic goods such as obsidian and decorated pottery. This is evident by the discovery of obsidian from Melanesia in Sabah, Malaysia, as well as in Polynesia, like Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, which is about 8,000 kilometers in distance. Yeah. At the same period, around 3,500 to 2,500 years ago, pottery that previously unknown in Melanesia began to make and use there. It is known as the Lapita pottery. The long-distance exchange has been proven to involve other goods, including bird feather, spices, fragrant woods, camphor, and various types of plants that have been cultivated in the archipelago, like bananas, taro, limes, mango, etc. This is the main commodities distribute in the global circumstances. Yeah. The long process of interaction and adaptation in the aquatic environment interspersed with land give rise to the distinctive civilization, which might be called the archipelagic civilization. They always maintain harmonious relationship with God, fellow human, and nature. They tended to be multicultural, tolerant, inclusive, but critical, since they were always exposed to other culture. They really respect women because of their vital role, both as commodity producer and family caretakers. That's why they applied something like a matrilineal and matrilocal system of kinship. Yeah. Austronesian people have an independent spirit, not easily colonized, and are cosmopolitan with an outward-looking perspective formed from extensive exploration experiences and meeting with various nations. At sea, they were considered pirates, of course, by the colonists, since they did not want to compromise their freedom. Colonialism has always been contested relentlessly in archipelago. Although we are quote unquote colonized, but there is never really put in the peace. People always rebel, because they want to be free, because basically they are free men. Formerly, scholars tended to perceive the early dispersal of the Austronesian to the west was confined to the western part of island Southeast Asia. The occurrence of some Indian culture elements, such as Carnelian beads, iron, Arikamedu pottery, has been seen as evidence for the active role of Indian traders who sailed to Southeast Asia to seek commodities from this region, such as rhinoceros horn, camphor, spices, bird feather, etc., and brought with them Indian goods for exchange. The existence of Austronesian in Madagascar was seen as a result of later migration, which took place during the Srivijaya Kingdom reign in 7th century AD. However, recently, archaeological research in some Indian and Pakistani sites recovered cultural material and plant remains which might have been brought by Austronesians to those places. Like in Sangkala site, they found the remain of citrus, lemon, areca, mango, and sandalwood, which come from Southeast Asia island. The same discovery was occurred in Patanam, about 3,000 years ago. Citrus, lemon, areca, mango, and teakwood, possibly from eastern Indonesia, was found in the site. And even in the Kordiji, very ancient port, they also find banana phytoliths. That's the silica part of the plant, which is not rotten. Yeah, it's not disappeared. So archaeologists we can find it. Yeah. Southeast Asian plant recovered from Pathanam sites of India suggests the important role of Austronesian sailor in bringing new cultural influence in the formation of Indian culture. They played an active role in their interaction of Chinese as well as Indian civilization. In Cameroon side, Africa, banana phytoliths were also found at a layer dated to 2,500 BP. That means the plantain have already been there for 2,500 BP. This proves that Austronesian has sailed to Western Asia and eastern coast of Africa at least 3,000 BP. Around 2,500 BP in Southeast China Sea, archaeological research in Taiwan, Northern Philippines, and Vietnam demonstrated an exchange network which was established around 2,500 PP. One of the traded artifacts was ornament made of jade from Fengtian in Taiwan, such as an ear pendant called Ling Ling O and double-headed animal pendant. Apparently, those jade artifacts were exchanged as a new precious goods within the new emerging trading network. This trading network extended to Thailand, Malaysia, and northern part of Borneo. You can see from the shaded part of in the map. Yeah. Later on, began around 2,500 years ago, another exchange network developed that involved Vietnam, Malay Peninsula, and Indian archipelago as far as West Papua. This network was indicated by distribution of the Dongson metal culture. Yeah, this is all of metal culture originated from Dongson in Vietnam, and then they distributed up to the Melanesia as well, Papua, West Papua. Those two exchange networks joined together with the Western Southeast Asia Bengal Bay Network to form a greater interregional trade network that connect the South China Sea and Indian Ocean. This interregional network enabled the establishment of relationship between two centers of civilization, that is India and China, via island Southeast Asia. It was through this interregional network that the influence of Indian and China civilization entered the island Southeast Asia, especially in the western part of especially in the western part, with the Indian culture seemed to be more predominant. Interaction with Indian civilization has led the adoption of Indian culture by Southeast Asian communities. The adoption of Indian culture seemed to have instigated the so-called globalization. That means the global and local, in which the globalizing Indian culture was embraced, but its articulation was determined by the local culture itself. In this case, the Indian culture is seen as a means for Southeast Asian elite to increase power, to exercise local integration. The result was the emergence of Hinduistic kingdom. Yeah, I mean Hinduistic here is not limited to Hindu in terms of religion, but also Indian as the whole, including the Buddhist kingdom as well. Such a global process that occurred in early centuries AD introduced more commodities, especially spices, aromatic, and animal products from island Southeast Asia to the Western world. This global network is known then as the spice route. The spice routes become an alternative commodity channel from the east to the west beside the Silk Road from China to Mediterranean. Austronesian sailors might have sailed into the Red Sea in the first century AD, as Pliny also mentioned that about the brave sailor from the east who in simple boats came bringing spices like cloves, cinnamon, kaharu, camphor, and incense. Apparently, spices are popular with Westerners. They really need it, and they were very eager to get it. The increasing need for spices and the difficulty of getting them from intermediary traders caused them to try hard to go to their original sources. Some scholars attribute this desire to derive spices from their original sources to the rise of capitalism in Europe and the colonization of the island world of Asia. Such an effort was triggered investment of individual capital to gain personal profit and ultimately give rise to the stock market, which would later become the main characteristic of capitalism. Columbus was one of the first sailors whose voyage to the east was supported by private capital and succeeded in reaping multiple profit. This became a model followed by many parties so that capitalism grew rapidly. Capitalism drove Western colonialism and overexploitation of their colony, especially in the island world, which was the source of the commodity. Colonialism were not only overexploited its natural resource, but also changed its human character through education system. The Industrial Revolution made the situation even worse because it gave rise to the increasingly strong consumerism, so that natural as well as human exploration become more massive. Orientalism is also responsible for the construction of a new national identity that is not rooted in local wisdom. Now, island people have become land-oriented people who tend to be non-egalitarian or less inclusive. They tend to forget the need to always maintain the harmonious relationship between God, fellow human, and nature. The paradise has been betrayed. Now I will close my presentation with remembering and quote what Wallace message in his book, The Word of Life. In this book, Wallace wrote on the evil of capitalism. He mentioned that to pollute a spring or a river, to exterminate a bird or beast should be treated as a moral offenses and as social crimes. Sin to deface or destroy that which has been brought into existence for the use and enjoyment, the education and elevation of human race is a direct denial of wisdom and goodness of the Creator, about which they so loudly and persistently pray and preach. All those destruction, this is mine, just to summarize, has been done by all the greatest nation claiming the first place for civilization and religion. And what is worse, the greater part of this waste and devastation has been and is being carried on not for any good or worthy purpose, but in the interest of personal greed and avarice. Every case where wealth was increased in the hand of the few millions are still living without the bare necessaries for a healthy or a decent life. Thousands dying yearly of actual starvation, and other thousands being slowly or suddenly destroyed by hideous disease or accident, directly caused in this cruel race of wealth, and in almost every case easily preventable. Yet they are not prevented solely because to do so would somewhat diminish the profit of the capitalists and legislators who are directly responsible for this almost worldwide defacement and destruction and virtual massacre of the ignorant and defenseless worker. Let us hope that the 20th century will see that the conscience of our rulers will no longer permit a single man, woman, or child to have its life shortened or destroyed by any preventable cause. However profitable the present system may be to their employers, that no one shall be allowed to accumulate wealth by labor of others unless and until every laborer shall have received sufficient not only for a bare subsistence, but for all the reasonable comfort and enjoyment of life, including ample recreation and provision of a restful and happy old age. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pak Daud. I find that interesting before the questions coming. So the idea that being an island or being a cluster of islands gives you specific characteristic, which you mentioned, giving you an aquatic environment, and that leads to certain kind of civilization and cultural development, which is typical to that clusters of island. And then the second one, I find that it is interesting that you mentioned globalization actually has happened over and over and over again, not just once, but since the old age. And I was wondering whether it's possible to have globalization without colonization. So I find that it will be interesting to compare the different kinds of globalization that's happened more than once. So now I would like to have 15 minutes to open to questions from the audience. Does anybody have any burning questions? Anybody? While we wait for the questions to come, maybe I would like to ask Pak Daud my second question, Pak. So looking at history, it is possible to have globalization without colonization. Can we repeat that again, Pak?
Yeah, I think it's possible when we really realize that we have to be equal. The equality is very important in this time. Yeah. Of course, influence from other culture is okay. Like Austronesian people always open to other culture. They try to adopt like Indian civilization or Chinese civilization. That's okay, but they are not colonized, and they have their freedom, and they try to have their freedom, although they fail. Yeah, but I think it is possible if we treat people the same. Yeah, of course we need some very hard effort to do that. Yeah, because now we are realize that the impact of capitalism is very destructive. Yeah, that's why now we try to move to another direction. If we try to read like the book written by Al Gore, The Future, I think he already mentioned about we have to be very careful with the capitalism. Yeah. Also, if we read the book by Stiglitz, for example, yeah, it is also Stiglitz or what, Jeffrey Sach, yeah, he also remind us to be mindful, yeah, in using our resource, for example, yeah, in treating our fellow human, for example. Yeah, I think this is possible if we come together.
Okay, thank you, Pat. And back to the audience, I was wondering whether you have other comments or questions. Yes, thank you so much. Would someone give her the mic? Yes. Can we have your name and affiliation, please, if you don't mind?
Oh, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I'm Li Xingxu from Taiwan National Zhenji University. I have a quick question about one of the slides where you talk about how the spice route is one of the early signs of globalization and how that can be contrasted with the Silk Road, where you have the more landed way of spreading trade session. It kind of reminds me of a Silk Road book I read earlier about a Yale professor talking about how the development of Silk Roads are associated with the militarized trade post trading posts are also being militarized. So it's itself also a sign of well, different kind of colonization. I wonder if you could comment briefly on the contrast between those two, if that's relevant to your own research. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Pak Daud, silakan.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's why I mentioned that the Austronesian approach to trade is quite different. Yeah, because they try not to use the military, but they use something like a cultural approach. Yeah, we don't have any traces or archaeological evidence that show or demonstrate that Austronesian quite offensive, something like that. Yeah, but they even they try to be inclusive. Yeah, and they are realize that when they have to go to other places, they need other people as the host. For example, there are many influences, Austronesian influences in Sri Lanka, for example. Yeah, the Prau, yeah, and the linguistic, yeah, the language as well, yeah. But there is no evidence that they are colonized or, yeah, or even a military something, yeah, offensive military, offensive, something like that, yeah. And also in the Polynesia, they trade with no forces, yeah. But of course, there are some conflicts, yeah, it's true. But this is not colonization, yeah, something like that, yeah. So I think the approach is quite different, yeah. Yeah, I think that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you, Pak. I find it interesting that when you do the Silk Road, it's through land on the north, and then the Spice Road is like by sea,
Yeah,
to the south, and that gives a different characteristic in terms of how they get along with people along the way.
yeah.
So I find that interesting as well. Thank you. And we have second person. Yes?
Right. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I am Yiping Liang from National Taiwan Normal Universities. I'd like to follow up on Li Xing question. That's very much, wonderful observation of the parallel history of the Silk Road and the spice trade. So it comes to my mind the work by Amitash Ghosh, The Nutmeg's Curse, a parable for a planet in crisis, is really a wonderful footnote to what you have described about the spice trade throughout the history. My questions really is that the slide that shows Russell Wallace maybe the third or the fourth slides to the last one, you mentioned his work. I don't know about that particular book. I don't know if you can go to that slide that shows Alpha Russel Wallace. I think it's the last. Right, yeah. I don't know. I don't know about that book, but I don't know if you would like to also say something about his book, Island Life. Island Life, in which he talks about the origin of the flora and the fauna, especially on the islands, and how the islands from an ecological perspective serves really as an important laboratory for our understanding of biogeography. And his site is actually the huge archipelago in this particular area, the Malay archipelago. So that's really, I would like you to comment further on the importance of his research and insight on the ecological importance of the Malay archipelago. Thank you.
Oh, so the question was, sorry, the question.
The importance of, from an ecological perspective, the importance of Malay archipelago in relation to Wallace scientific research at the end of the 19th century. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, Wallace is very well known for the divided flora and fauna from the oriental fauna and flora and the Australasian fauna, because he said that it is very important to know the distribution of many flora and fauna in the world, because if we don't have the knowledge of the flora and fauna, then it will be difficult for us to take care of them. Yeah. So actually, it is the first time that people can recognize there are many, like not really a kingdom, but something like a separation between the Eastern Indonesia and Western Indonesia. Yeah. And this also have impact on the culture as well. And because not too many people come to the eastern part of Indonesia, there is still more, what you call it, more authentic. We can still find many of the, like endemic fauna, fauna or flora, which is very specific to the island because of their adaptation. And also some of the fauna and flora which are extinct in other parts of the world. And I think it's not only Wallace, but also Darwin found this something like, we call it as a laboratory, and they preserve many kind of life quite still in genuine form, something like that. Yeah, because they are not often exploited or something like that. But in the case of the continental, they are easily hunted by people, or it's not quite secure, something like that. But in the island, because of the insularity or the isolated condition, they are more preserved. Yeah, that's why he think that human have uh, very important role in ecology. Yeah, I think that's the message that I get from the island life as well as the word of life. Yeah, this his books. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I find it interesting how the idea of being separated and being connected, for the islands being separated and the continent being connected, actually creates two different kinds of civilization, and how now we are inheriting the juggling part, because now we are separated and connected at the same time. We're doing the both at the same time. So yeah, thank you so much, Pak. And I think we still have one very quick comment, Pak. 30 seconds, Pak, because we only have 1 minute, but I don't want to waste it. So yes, please, Pak. 30 seconds.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very quick one. My name is Dharma from Bali. Thank you for insightful presentation, Professor Daud. My question is, do you think it's a really capitalism cause a human problem? Don't you see that the number of population that caused the problem? We saw that last century, the number of population is 1 billion. Now it's 8 billion. So we understand that people try to do what they can do, and we tend to scapegoating capitalism. I'd like to hear your comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak. Pak, 30 seconds, Pak.
Yeah. Yeah, it's rather difficult to answer. Yeah, of course, the more population we need, the more resource to make their life. So I think the more resource we have to explore from the nature, I think this will impact our our earth. Of course, if we cannot something like I don't know, maybe something like an artificial resource or something like that to fulfill the human need. Yeah. It's that answer your question, or yeah, because if we depend on the natural resource, I'm afraid they will quickly deplete it when many more people will born and occupy the earth. Yeah. So I think we have to create something like a substitution resource. Yeah. That's why now we try to be although I'm not quite optimistic with the sustainable development, yeah, but I think we try to go there. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Pak Daud. It's interesting how the answer is like artificial resources, but now we're getting to the artificial intelligence first before the resources. I think we need to catch up with them before the artificial intelligence. We need to get to the artificial resources first. So now I think because this time is up for Pak Daud, can we just together give him a very big applause for the presentation? Thank you so much, Pak Daud, for the presentation. Can we give Pak Daud another round of applause, please? Thank you so much. So now we have the honor to invite our second speaker, Professor Oscar de Campomanes. Can we have Pak Oscar to the stage? Yes. Thank you, Pak Oscar. And while we are getting the slides ready, or apparently it's ready, allow me to actually very quickly read your bio. So Professor Oscar de Campomanes is actually Associate Professor of Literary and Cultural Studies, Department of English from Ateneo de Manila University, And maybe we are from UGM, we like to know this, that he was an ASEAN University Network own distinguished visiting professor in American Studies at Vietnam National University, Hanoi in 2001. And it's nice to know that you have published your book in 2022. It's a co-edited book with the Filipino economic historian Yoshiko Nagano and anthropologist Nobutaka Suzuki. It's about colonialism and modernity, remapping Philippine histories. So yeah, it's also published by the University Ateneo de Naga University Press. And now you are going to be talking about colonizing and commodifying the islandic, the transmutation of island dominions into floating islands. So it's 25 minutes. And before that, if you have 5 minutes, I will cue you. Yes. Thank you, sir. The floor is yours.
Have to use stronger glasses. Salamat pagi. Good morning to everyone, and in Tagalog, magandang umaga sa ating lahat. The talk actually clocks in for 40 minutes and I was reminded I only have 25. So I had to make some surgical cuts, but I hope that the presentation would go here anyway. And if it doesn't, you can ask for my email address and I can send you the full type script of the talk. Okay. First off, I would like to thank our Critical Island Studies Consortium, which is alive and thriving, especially, of course, winning this Moro and the organizing committee for this 2023 iteration of our conference series, but also Lulu Torres Reyes, Ied, Pedro Sitepu, and Melanie Budjanta, as well as Paulus Sorweto, who are the leading figures that helped us put the consortium together. Some of the critical ideas I'll be sharing with you this morning were encouraged and nurtured by the workshops of the Asia Theories Network. And I'm very happy to see fellow core members of the network here, Alex Tai Kwang Lee, Chunmei Chuang, Vince Serrano, and I don't know if Geoff Broadley is already in. So today I present my case study of the American Imperial Archipelago, its natural and artificial islands, as a model of the complex and functional ways in which the oceanic is extended by the islandic. With it, I provide a critical picture of how the flexible and worldwide ambit for the exercise of American imperial power and global hegemony is constellated through the islandic and its forms. Next slide, please. It is to one of our field's most prolific theorists, Antonis Balasopoulos, a Greek Cypriot literary scholar, that we owe the felicitous term island form, and which you will hear used all throughout the presentation. Balasopoulos builds this notion in turn upon Christian Jacobs' point in his book, The Sovereign Map, about the island as, quote, the most minimal unit of cartographic space in territorial and terrestrial terms, which has the virtue of being distillable to the singularity of a form, end quote. But I would add to that a plurality of forms. The basic and organizing category of the islandic in the field of critical island studies is certainly not new, having been amply shown by other scholars to circulate across time and across cultures, with Balasopoulos himself going so far as to say that in poetics, for example, quote, an insular geographic unconscious, end quote, is often imperceptibly at work. Something of this insular unconscious also seemed to have underwritten my own project some years ago. Next slide, please. I immediately noticed the resemblances in form and function between the island territories of the American Empire and the fleet of aircraft carriers. Yes, I'm going to be talking about aircraft carriers, which I'm going to describe as floating islands, that this empire had built over an extended period of development and maintains at great cost to connect and supplement such island dominions. So consider these two photodocumentary images in juxtaposition. An aerial view of the US territory of Guam, also called Guahan, in the Pacific, and a similarly angled photograph of the aircraft carrier USS Eisenhower. Now, in one visual sweep, right, of these images, one should be able to see the uncanny isomorphism between the geophysical form of Guam as an island and the islandic form and function of the aircraft carrier. Next slide. Another example here would be an aerial view of the US territory of Eniwetak Atoll in the Pacific, US Marshall Islands, and the new aircraft carrier prototype in development, the USS Ford. Very expensive. Speaking of commodities, no? Reconceptualizing the globalization, which is largely maritime, that has historically underpinned American imperial desire and designs, political philosopher Carl Schmitt once said, and I quote, "To imagine a maritime globe would seem strange indeed, and one could only persist in speaking naturally of the terrestrial sphere or the terrestrial globe if one ignored the fact that the surface of the planet is 3/4 water," end quote. On this view, in Smith's own words, quote, "Even the largest continents are but huge floating islands." Smith's observation has direct pertinence in terms of the analogy I developed in this presentation between the two kinds of islands afloat, or if you like, island forms by which we can characterize the curious geography and cartography of US neocolonial power. On the one hand, the littoral islands or island groups, including the Philippine archipelago, which the US annexed for much of the 20th century, and for being so regarded as territorially insignificant, could be made invisible, and if allowed to be afloat, could only be recognizable as, quote, "mere coaling stations or outposts." These are descriptors from the words of a US Secretary of War circa World War II. And on the other hand, the aircraft carriers that move between and among these island territories as floating islands, figuratively speaking. That is, as these kinds of islands afloat are able to virtually expand or extend American imperial dominion in amphibious and amorphous ways over a much more capacious maritime globe rather than a merely terrestrial one. The unusual planetary spread of this empire, based on what has been conventionally understood as a neo-colonial kind of extraterritorialism, in the words of a colleague of mine, Alan Panzalan Isaac, an empire without colonies, tends to obviate two things while simultaneously making them obvious. A, the singularity or exceptionality of such an empire, with its island dominions made invisible and insignificant in the process, and B, the spectacular manifestations of military naval might, otherwise and paradoxically made possible by the global ambits for it, which these island chains constellate across the high seas and oceans. In what follows, I surface the island forms of US colonialism or imperialism, examining the long-standing centerpiece of its naval and global mobility, the aircraft carrier, as both material medium and metaphor, floating islands, for its exercise of sea power, the very basis and mode of this empire's world hegemony. I argue that the peculiar history and geography of the constitution of this empire might be better distilled or theorized through the very forms, example, military and naval technology, that it takes, and which appear to borrow their very morphology from the kinds of islandic territories that this empire has absorbed, or the term, according to the US Supreme Court, is unincorporated. Before presenting my close reading, so I'm going to be a close reading the super aircraft carrier as material medium and metaphor for the Atlantic, archipelagic, and oceanic features of the American empire, it is necessary, I would think, to locate and surface the very island territories which the aircraft carrier at once displaces and supplements in its self-spectacularization of US imperial might. So by the way, the aircraft carrier was first dubbed Super with the Forrestal class of the 1950s, continuing on to the Nimitz class or prototype of the 1970s. Analytically, I make a point about their obviousness and our obliviousness to it as the preeminent expression of the active invisibilization of the USA's island neo-colonies. Incredulous as it may seem, what disappears from view with this phenomenon of active invisibilization can be found, even if only recessively so, in the most unlikely places. Now, in the instances I'm going to look at this presentation, believe it or not, a typical US postal service money order check, and a typical Atlas political map. And this phenomenon of invisibilization would be related to the extended metaphors of sinking or surfacing in relation to the aircraft carrier and the islandic later and toward the conclusion of the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, Neil Smith begins his groundbreaking volume on the lost geography of the American century with the apocryphal story of Philippine annexation that recounts, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, President William McKinley as, quote, fumbling with a map in uncontained jubilation, no? After Dewey's spectacular triumph over Admiral Montojo's fleet at Manila Bay in May 1898 was understood to have commended the Philippines to incipient US territorial claims upon them. But with McKinley, quote, eventually admitting to a friend that I could not have told where those darned islands were within 2,000 miles, end quote. In one satirical tweak on this allegedly true story, McKinley is described as not knowing whether Las Islas Filipinas, as the Spanish called it, were, quote, islands or sardines, end quote. McKinley's obliviousness, right, rendering the islands the United States were about to annex during his imperial presidency unlocatable and invisible. They have sunk from view, in other words, as early as the inaugural moments of their unincorporation has since become the formative and normative figure or image for imperial American citizens with no operative knowledge of their nation's former and current island possessions like the Philippines and current ones like Puerto Rico and Guam, among others. Now let's take a look, right, where we might be able to find the missing ones with the typical US Postal Service money order check, in which there are only two texts that are rendered in loud red ink. And they are thus signified as the first aspects to a commonplace federal transaction that should claim anybody's immediate attention. On the upper left hand, right, you can see it is the designated serial number, right, for the particular issue. And to the immediate right of the pay to field underneath the serial number is the crucial proviso, quote, negotiable only in the US and its possessions, end quote. Now, the significance of the former numerical seriality is obvious enough, but the signification of the latter statement and scope of negotiability is not. What does it mean for a federal guarantee like this to hold true in all states of the American Union and its possessions? What are the possessions referenced here? And what does it mean, right, for these non-states and the peoples who inhabit them to be possessed? And possessed by whom? Apart from the typical purchaser not possibly apprehending, right, this extension and distension of a federal guarantee beyond a demarcated US, and how a further and enigmatic distinction between states and possessions is simultaneously made, is yet another and perhaps more prior displacement. It can be described as an oxymoronic sleight of hand. It is a visibility that makes itself invisible, a visuality that produces a form of blindness. By precisely the check's typographical accents on serial number and negotiable domain, an effect of these texts' obviousness is generated that has the paradoxical impact of displacing itself from anyone's visual grasp. One, in effect, becomes oblivious to the obvious. Or to put it another way, what is here rendered visually obvious makes one assume, as if by some conditioned reflex, that what is thusly signified is both innocuous, serial number, every check has them, right? And natural, negotiable only in the US, and possessions. While highlighted in crimson tint, both texts immediately dissolve into that order of things we call matters of fact, or more precisely, they are presented and one seems expected to elide even what they signify as a matter of course. Last slide. To get a better sense of the typicality or reproducibility of these curious representations of the states and possessions of the United States and their naturalizing effects, one need only pay more attention than useful to representational modes such as equally commonplace, right, as weather maps on television news shows or even atlases. Here, this atlas political map. Now, as a matter of course, the North American continental trunk of the country and its impressive sprawl of 48 fully fledged states would constitute at a glance one's visual sweep of such mappings of the nation's states. Sidebar in miniaturized boxes on some fringe quadrant of the frame would be the two non-contiguous states of Hawaii, right, and its recessive spread in the distant North Central Pacific, and Alaska with its subcontinental mass, and two northwest, right, of the continent to be reflected to scale. Of all the so-called possessions, and there's a fairly good number of them that can count as such, it is probably the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico, to the southeast of the Florida Panhandle and in the Caribbean, that one could presume to be marginally known to viewers. Indeed, but Puerto Rico, do you see it there? Right, it's not even there, right? Is invariably excluded from such framings. Indeed, one is apparently predisposed not to expect that tiny island, actually it's an archipelago in its own right, to appear as part of what is imaginable and visible as the United States of America in these cartographic representations. Forget about Guam, forget about American Samoa and other Pacific and Caribbean island territories, which are simply beyond the perceptual and cognitive fields that are being here supposed for everyday or typical viewers' geographic apprehension and consciousness. I'll proceed to the concluding part of the presentation. I hope still have enough time. In the American Studies classic, Amusing the Million, Coney Island at the turn of the century, the cultural historian John Casson argues that the switchback train or rail, a mode of transport that in the 19th century took mine workers from the surface, often on a precipitously angled ride down to the bowels of the earth in deep pit mining, or which was used to move extracted ore across jagged terrain to the stock depots, was actually the forerunner of today's roller coasters, right? That centerpiece attraction of the modern American amusement park. Casson practically contends that the magnates of American mass entertainment at the turn from the 19th to the 20th centuries took their cues from the USA's captains of industry in devising the forms of mass entertainment or leisure to aid in the regeneration, right, of workers' bodies after or in the fashion of the very industrial forms or mechanisms by which such workers' labor power was expropriated by capitalists of the period. So switchback, rail, or train. Something analogous happened, I wish to argue, in the conception and development of the US aircraft carrier, called beginning in the 1950s and especially in the 1990s, the super aircraft carrier. That capital ship or flagship vessel of the US Navy to date and since World War II, but especially so during the Cold War, which proved eminently useful and arguably still does, right, for the USA in its war and geopolitical maneuvers as a global sea power and imperial hegemon. Seemingly designed to simulate and form the very islands and island groups in the Pacific and other oceans or seas constituting the planetary spread of the US empire, especially as this developed after the conquest of the Philippines. The aircraft carrier truly embodies and symbolizes such functions of spectacularity and signification.
Excuse me, 5 minutes.
Yes. How many? 5 minutes? Okay, that's fine. Yeah. In the extraterritorialism for which the USA became known exceptionally as an empire, without colonies. Now, most of these extra territories, after their respective histories of annexation, were primarily built up and treated as naval military bases or coaling stations in 19th century parlance to signify their crucial role in the refueling and repair of US Navy ships and vessels of all kinds, as these were deployed to patrol major sea lanes in geostrategic zones or trouble spots around the world. These island territories and the military bases in them continue to serve as the land-based coordinates and docking points for the Icelandic aircraft carriers and other high-grade US naval vessels, and which in reciprocal function, right, can be seen, these aircraft carriers, as seaborne military bases themselves. It is beyond dispute that aircraft carriers, with their capacity for deployment or disengagement at any time, everywhere in the world, best made possible and still enable the flexibility and mobility with which we would typically associate the pursuit or performances of US global power over the past century and in the present. Most significantly, these steel leviathans of the high seas embody such flexibility and mobility, quite obviously crucial, it seems to me, to the claim of this empire of its novelty, especially if compared and contrasted to its classical antecedents and their own respective forms of power projection, like Great Britain and France in the age of empires, or Portugal and Spain in discovery era or mercantile imperialism. A mere basic description of the US aircraft's features and of the naval technological wizardry of which it has often been held up as a quintessential exemplar, especially after this 30-year period of intensive development and innovation of it since the end of World War II, should be convincing for any doubting skeptic. In the words of Navy policy analyst Michael Crepon, quote, "All are the arguments over the size, composition, and purposes of tomorrow's Navy eventually return to this ship. Like the battleship or the battleship cruiser before it, the carrier has become the capital ship of the fleet, the sun around which military budgets and lesser ships orbit. It is a 94,000-ton floating airfield which carries 90 aircraft, 5,300 men and women, and 2 nuclear reactors. Apart from the US having the largest fleet of aces in the world, 11 at latest count, with a new and even more supermodel, the Ford-class AC in development, each AC, whose cost of construction has averaged between 10 to $12 billion, is designed to be unsinkable, impregnable to any attacks against it by any enemy ships or submarines. It is vaunted as the ultimate weapon of its class in terms of both offense and defense. Now I'm looking at my watch and I only have a minute left. Thank you so much for keeping tabs on it. So I will just conclude with this additional note or observation. And then if you have any questions, for the rest of the presentation, which I had to skip, and which you guess would be there, please post them. Okay. Where the island territory is fixed in place, the other an Icelandic aircraft carrier floats at sea. Yet American island territories, possessions, or outposts at various times have been called unsinkable aircraft carriers themselves, And the ACs have been termed as floating islands or floating airports or floating cities, resulting in a transference of qualities and characteristics, right, between our natural island and the artificial one. The islandic, the form is shared by both kinds of islands. For example, Douglas MacArthur controversially called Taiwan as the America's, quote, unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Cold War era containment of the People's Republic of China in the 1950s. Even Japan, as the USA's major ally in the Asia-Pacific region, was characterized to be so. Same phraseology, America's unsinkable aircraft carrier, by no less than its own prime minister during the Reaganite era. And just as no island is no island, the aircraft carrier has its archipelagic analog in the carrier battle fleet that accompanies it in deployments and operations, consisting of missile-guided warships or destroyers and at least one submarine. So 6 or 7 other vessels floating, and in the case of the submarine, sinking isles themselves. Thank you very much. I have to end there.
Thank you so much. Really interesting how the island and the aircraft carrier actually provide metaphors for each other. And while the island is seen as the unsinkable craft and the aircraft is seen as the floating island, it's really interesting to see what will happen to the people, both on the island and on the craft. So I found it really, really interesting. I hope there will be questions and comments about this. So you're on time, so we'll have like 15 minutes.
I was scared of it.
I was staring at you, like giving you quotes, like, should I dance? Like, okay, questions, comments, any opinions, particularly from the literature department, this idea of having metaphors for things. How is it the way you see things will define your practice or your attitude? Which one comes first? Is it your attitude and then you have this way of thinking, or because you have this way of thinking and then you have this way of, treating other people or the practice? Yes, questions? Or while we wait for the question, perhaps would you comment on the what will happen to the people then? Because you were talking about the islands and everything, but I was thinking about, so because that would continue on with what Daud mentions, after being separated for so long, and then comes this.
Yeah, this is working. This is
Yes,
working.
it's working.
Yeah. You mean the inhabitants of the island
Yeah, yeah.
territories themselves? Okay, so of course one thing to which they are subjected is what I'm calling active invisibilization. And you can think of it, no matter how hyperbolic it may sound that by being made invisible, right, these islands get depopulated, right? So, right, like what you're having here is actually a depopulation of the islands, which the islanders, which kind of makes them even more vulnerable, right? Like to the kinds of displacement, abjection, right? And even denial of their rights, for example, of domicile. That, right, Guamanians, American Samoans, Okinawans, people like the Chagos Islanders in Diego Garcia Island, and even people in Puerto Rico are routinely and daily subjected to. So not surprisingly, right? Like the most vibrant and energetic anti-base and anti-American imperial movements we have seen in recent decades have come from cultural activists, right? Ordinary citizens, writers and poets from these islands themselves, and whose work I think we haven't checked them out. We should.
Yeah, and the depopulation is a bit sad because maybe you don't disappear physically, but you disappear culturally. So I saw a hand there. Thank you. And another hand there. Yes, the gentleman. And a third hand. Okay, we'll have to divide this very strictly, sir. The gentleman at the back. And I saw you, sir, yes. And then the third one is there, so yeah.
Thank you very much, Oka, for the very engaging presentation. And I have to apologize that I think my question is only tangentially connected to the presentation. Your topic is about aircraft carrier, so that's the object of critique. But what if we extend the example also to merchant ships? So since the age of mercantilism, the ship is already understood to be an extension of the flag. But in globalized age, you would have goods from different countries, sea personnel, seamen coming from different nations. So I think it's also coming from your reflection about the aircraft carrier. Yeah, what insights probably can we start with in thinking about the merchant ship? Thank you.
Thank you for that.
How many seconds do I
Ah.
have per response?
Let me calculate that. 6 minutes divided by 3 questions. Perfect.
So I'm trying
Yes,
to be very quick.
strict with the
Yeah.
focus.
Thank you, Francis, for that question. It's a very good one. And when, of course, you extend, right, the object of critique from something military, naval, like the aircraft carrier, to something more kind of like global or globalizing, like, right? The the cruisers, the merchant ships now flying the trade routes all over the world. You make a shift from the imperial to the global, and which is where you can kind of like begin to also help surface, right? The island populations like the Filipinos, from right like the invisibilization that the aircraft carrier and the American Empire subjects them to. What do I mean by that? 50% of overseas contract workers are seaborne. They're seamen. And so that's how dependent actually the mercantile shipping is today on Filipino labor. And some of the most interesting work on identity formation, adaptation and survival, and even resistance, now, at least coming from the Philippines, has to do with right, like these seamen and sea women, mainly men. So the work I would suggest checking out the work of Caleb Bantigue Fajardo, right? Who's done an ethnography of island life on these ships or vessels, right? And how they reckon with their displacement and right, like help settle themselves in using their imagination and using the kinds of strategies or techniques that they develop for spending something like 8 months of any given year of their life being afloat and being elsewhere on the planet rather than back home with their families in the Philippines.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. It's interesting how you have aircraft, merchant ships, and cruise ships, and how they would differ, or maybe they would provide similar things, but yeah, also differences. Yeah. Thank you. And the second hand there, yeah, I saw you, and yes.
Hi, Oka. Great talk. Brilliant, as usual. Anyway, this is just a brief comment, Oka, on your lecture. You were juxtaposing islands, right? Islands and the carrier as floating islands, right? But funny thing is that islands do sink, right? While islands sink, they move, they disappear, they
actually
die.
do.
Floating island, pardon? Floating islands
Jakarta
actually
is
don't.
sinking.
They are unsinkable, right?
Yeah.
They move elsewhere to more stable grounds, to rootedness, right? So that's just it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that comment.
Would you like to
For-
comment very
yeah,
quickly on
very
the comment?
quickly,
30
very
seconds.
quickly, because you said something about the importance and the possible usefulness of metaphorical thinking, right? For the kinds of critical work that we do. I use the formulation material, medium, and metaphor, right, with respect to the aircraft carrier. But actually, metaphorically, the aircraft carrier can be seen from a very materialist point of view, right? Which is that, right, like in this particular case, with the analogy to the actual island territories themselves, if you try to recall that metaphor comes, right, from the Greek word metaphorein, which means to transfer, right? What happens there in an analogy and a metaphor like that between actual island territories and the floating islands that aircraft carriers what happens there is a transference of qualities that's, to use Kafka's word, metamorphic, right? Rather than simply metaphorical, right? Like for Kafka, metaphor is that material or materialist, right? Like there's after the comparison between two unlikely things, right? We can no longer look at each one of them in the same way ever again. So it's very, very material.
Thank you. Very interesting how metaphors actually transfers
Yeah.
or have an exchange of
Yeah.
quality
Qualities
between the two things that is being metaphor, so to speak. Thank you so much. And yes, the kind gentleman at the front has been waiting for so long for this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. And then, as always, I'm quite inspired by when you talk. Yeah, my question is quite quick about some symbolic dominance, no, symbolic dominion over the islands. You talk about that aircraft carrier is a kind of floating island, but thing is that this floating island actually the territorialized that ever existing island geographically. It means it actually it could be called the island, but actually that is a sort of extension of landic territory onto this archipelagic the unknown field, in my opinion. So if we build up some alternative order to this kind of second post world war, the water system, we must actually touch this kind of symbolic power, symbolic system to dominion the over this archipelagic. So could you elaborate on this idea? Then for the more resistance or some kind of the alternative idea to this existing order.
Absolutely.
Would you like to
Yeah.
quickly comment on the
As
comment?
usual, the comment is much appreciated if it comes from Alex. And the question, if there was one, can be quite overwhelming, very difficult to address. But yes, in the way I see it, for example, also in terms of the turns that we've been taking within the last 2 or 3 years in our field of critical island studies in our region, right, expanding into East Asia. And at some point, I think we should really invite our Pacific Islander colleagues, right? Because they're missing, maybe from Guam and Hawaii, right? Even Fiji and Tonga. The turn being like the turn from our studies, critical studies and examination of, the Icelandic, the turn from there to the oceanic, right? Like the term floating islands, for example, in reference to aircraft carriers that I made in this presentation, comes from Schmidt, right? And although the earliest deployment of the term floating islands, in reference in particular to aircraft carriers that I found was in 1920 by a science writer named Grace Jones, right? Who was reporting about certain new inventions in transoceanic aviation, right? And transportation called sea drones. And it is speculated at this point, for example, that the landing field feature of the aircraft carrier develops, right, from these so-called sea drones, right? I was getting to a point which that I was describing here, right, in a sense, kind of like this spectacular or sub-spectacular spread and exercise of American air power precisely through these natural as well as artificial islands, which is to exercise that power over a much more capacious, in amorphous and amphibious ways, over a much more capacious maritime globe rather than merely a terrestrial one. I don't know if that responds to your question.
Are we done this?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. And that is the last question for this session. I would like to invite you all to give a very big applause for our speakers. So just very quickly, before we close, I would like to actually link the idea from Pak Daud and Pak Oscar. It's really interesting how having these islands, actually, the exchange that Pak Daud is telling is about material exchanges, like the objects and the things, and then you are telling about how the exchange of qualities, and then how it's interesting if we can continue discussion later on, how the exchange of power, whether or not it's equal or balanced, that's interesting. So again, can we have a big round of applause for both speakers? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I'll return this session to the Master of Ceremony. Thank you so much. You want to clap for me? Feel free. Nobody's clapping for me. I know.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Daud, and also Dr. Oscar for the very insightful lectures. And also thank you, Dr. Suzy, for leading our discussion. Please give a round of applause again for our speakers and moderator. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now we are going to have coffee break and then followed by the panel sessions. Before you leave the auditorium, I would like to give some announcement. First, the foods are provided at the hall in front of the auditorium. And then our first panel session will begin at 10:30 a.m. And then the second panel session will be conducted at 1 p.m. after the lunch break and then followed by the coffee break. And for the third panel session will be conducted at 3 p.m. after the coffee break. Please refer to the conference kit to find your schedule and also the presentation room. And finally, the audience are expected to return to the auditorium at 4:45 to have the closing ceremony. Now, I would like to invite you all to enjoy our refreshment at the hall. Thank you and enjoy our coffee break.